Hi, I'm Glenn Rogers, and this is Biblical Insights. In our video today, we're going to answer the question, is there an afterlife? I think that's an important question that at some point or other, most people think about. We know this life exists because we're here, we're living it. We're born, we're living our lives, but someday, at some point, we're going to die. Then what? Well, for some people, that's the end. You just cease to exist and you're gone. And for other people, death represents something like a transition into another phase of life, or another birth into another phase of life. So, which is it? Is there life after death or not? We're going to see if we can't think our way through that question. Now, the previous video we did was on the existence of God, and I commented there that we really don't use the Bible for that because, using the Bible to prove the existence of God because the Bible is inspired by God is a circular argument, so that's no good. For these kinds of discussions, you have to lay the Bible aside and think rationally, not look for answers in the book, but think through it yourself and figure things out. Try to develop a logically sound, rational argument that you can, hang your hat on and say, this is what I believe and this is why I believe it, because I reasoned it out. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing today. So, is there an afterlife? In ancient times, I'm talking, clear back to ancient Greece, the time of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, that sort of thing, several hundred years before the birth of Jesus. Sorry, we had a little glitch there. What I was saying is, we go back to ancient Greece, we're talking about something that occurred several hundred years before the birth of Jesus. And when they had this discussion about the afterlife, it was referred to as the immortality of the soul. That's how they talked about it. So in ancient times, they thought about the soul as that part of you which was separate from your body. And the question was, is after your body dies, does the soul go on to live? And this was an important discussion that philosophers had. In modern times, we discuss this not under the heading of the immortality of the soul, but under what's called the philosophy of the mind. Okay, so I refer to the inner part of us as the mind. Some people call it soul, some people call it spirit. Doesn't matter really what you call it. You can call it whichever you want. I just prefer the terminology mind. Now, what this discussion really has to do with is two basic points of view about the kind of being a human being is. And there are two different positions. One is that of materialism, and the other is that of dualism. A materialist is a person who accepts the idea of materialism, and it is the idea that only physical things exist. Okay, that's all there is. Stuff that's made out of subatomic particles and atoms and molecules, excuse me, and things like that. That's all there is just physical stuff. Okay, that's materialism. And if you believe that, you are a materialist. Technically, it would be a monistic materialist, because monism is the idea of one. Mon is one. Monism is there's only one kind of stuff, and the stuff is physical stuff or material stuff. So materialism, monistic materialism, whichever. The other position is dualism, and that says there's at least two different kinds of stuff. There is physical stuff, to be sure. There are things that are made up of subatomic particles and atoms and molecules and all that stuff. It's a physical stuff that we understand that exists in the world, and it's not, alive per se. It's just, dirt, rocks, water, air, that sort of thing. the planet. Just everything is just physical. But dualism takes the position that there is that, the physical stuff, and that there is also mental stuff. There's the other side of the equation. There's mind. And mind is a thinking kind of a substance, and it is immaterial. So you have the difference or the contrast between the material and the immaterial. And so in the ancient world, the soul would have been immaterial. Today, we usually think in terms of the mind as being immaterial. Now, some people think the mind and the brain is the same thing. They're just two different words for the same thing, but that's not the case. The brain is a physical organ. It's encased in your skull, and it's this little thing that's about so big, and it weighs 7 pounds or something like that. And you can take it out of the skull, and you can weigh it, and you can cut it open, you can dissect it, you can plug electrodes into it while a person is alive, and put stuff on their head, and you can see different parts of the brain light up, and electrical circuits shooting back and forth and everything. And the brain is a physical organ that functions and does some very specific things. Well, what about the mind? Well, you can't get a hold of the mind. It isn't a physical organ. It's an immaterial entity, okay? And so many people, because they can't see it, they can't get a hold of it, they can't dissect it and weigh it and put electrodes on it and measure it and all this other stuff. They think, well, it doesn't exist. If I can't see it and handle it, then I don't believe it exists. And so those are the materialists. Dualists say, well, yeah, it's not something you can see or feel physically, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's there, and they have a different kind of evidence for its existence other than empirical evidence. Okay, here's the thing with the difference between the brain and the mind. Okay, now this is kind of hard to follow, so please listen carefully, okay? Because this is important. The brain is encased in your skull, okay? And it's attached, comes up through your spine and the spinal cord and the brain stem and everything, and it's all attached in there. And it does its job based upon the data that comes into it via your physical senses. In other words, things you see, things you hear, things you smell, things you taste, things you can touch. Okay, the senses, the sensory data that comes into the brain is what the brain has to work with. And the thing is, because the brain is encased in the skull, the only data that it has to work with is what comes into it via the sensory apparatus. Okay, that's the only stuff that can get into the brain. That's the only information or data that the brain has to work with, is stuff that you see and experience with your senses in the physical world. Okay, you get that? You understand that? That's very, very important piece of information, and we have to keep that in mind. The brain is limited to the physical data that comes to it via your sensory system. That's all it has to work with. That's all it has to work with. So it can deal with things you see. It can deal with things you hear. It can deal with things you smell. The smell of bacon cooking in the morning, the brain goes, ooh, bacon, I like that. Okay? Or some very nice perfume that someone might be wearing or whatever, or something not so nice, you go, oh, what is that? Things you smell, things you hear, things you taste, things you can touch and feel and go, all right, that's a nice thing. Okay? Or if it's something else, if it's something hot, ow, or something sticky, or a thorn, and it hurts you when you touch it. Okay, we have all of these physical sensations that we get from the world, and the sensory system is set up then to send that data into the brain, and the brain works with it. The brain analyzes it and determines what kind of stuff it is. It deconstructs it if need be and reconstructs it if need be, and it stores it, and then it can call it up and bring it back out to use later. The brain's very amazing. It's phenomenal in what it can do. It's just an amazing organ. But, and here's the thing, okay, you have stuff in your head that has nothing to do with your physical senses and the physical world. You think about things that are not part of the physical world. And the question is, how'd they get into the brain? There's no way for them to get in there. There's no way. Because they're not things you see or hear or smell or taste or touch. So how do they get into the brain? Because the only way data can get into the brain is through your sensory system. Okay? But yet you have stuff in your brain that didn't get in there through the sensory system. You have stuff that you think about. So is that the brain thinking about stuff that's not part of the physical world? I suggest to you that there is a better explanation, another different explanation, and that's the dualistic explanation, that in addition to the physical brain, there is the immaterial mind, and that the mind is the real you, the real personal identity that is you, where you think about things, you analyze things, you weigh alternatives, you make choices, you have a will in which you say, I will do that, or I will not do that, okay? And this real you is the essence of you. Now, this is encased, for the time being, in a physical body, and we call that embodiment. You're an embodied being, okay? And so you have the brain and the mind working in conjunction with each other. The mind utilizes the brain in much the same way that the brain utilizes the hand. The brain sends signals, down the system into the arm and says, pick that up, and you reach out and you pick something up. And that's the brain using the hand to accomplish a purpose, okay? Well, the mind uses the brain in a similar way, but the mind is the real you, okay? Now, what if someone says, well, okay, but think about hearing. You hear someone talk about justice, or you hear someone talk about courage, or you hear someone talk about equality, or you hear someone talk about rights, and that's how those things get into the brain, so that the brain can think about them. Well, okay, yes, at this stage, yes, okay, because those things are part of our vocabulary and we talk about those things, and so you hear them and they get into the brain, and the brain can then process that information. But if we utilize the process of regression and we go back in time, back thousands of years, maybe millions of years, nobody knows for sure, but back to some of the very, 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 very first human beings, to exist. And let's call these human beings Fred and Barney, okay? Maybe they had discovered flint and they knew how to make fire, or maybe they hadn't discovered that yet, but we can call them the Flintstones if you want, Fred and Barney. Okay, and they're walking around one day. Maybe they're hunting, or maybe they're looking for another source of water or something back in this primeval world. And they're walking around, and Fred says something to Barney about justice. And Barney says, "What? Justice? What's that?" Okay, and so they start having a discussion about justice. Now, in this thought experiment, we're going to say that there's just these two guys, just Fred and Barney. That's it. That's all there is. And we're not going about where they came from or any of that kind of stuff for this experiment. We're just going to say there's two people, Fred and Barney, and they are the first humans. And if you're not comfortable with that, let's say it's Fred and Betty, okay? All right. So you got a male and a female. It's Fred and Betty, and Fred says, "What about justice? What do you think about that?" And Betty says, "What? What's justice? I don't know what that is. Where did they get that idea to talk about it? It's not something that was part of the physical world. They didn't see it. They didn't smell it. They didn't taste it. They didn't touch it. And because there were no other people around, because these are the two original people, no one had ever discussed it. No one had ever brought it up. How did the concept of justice get into Fred's brain so that he could talk about it? Well, see, there's no way it could. There's absolutely no way it could, because the only data that can get into the brain is the physical data recorded by the physical sensory system and then sent to the brain via the nervous system and the electrical impulses. Okay, that's all that can get to the brain. But in that context, there's no way the concept of justice could ever have gotten into Fred's brain. And yet, throughout the ages, people have thought about justice. And they've thought about other concepts too, like freedom and rights and equality and courage and all sorts of things. Morality. Okay? How do human beings have access to those sorts of concepts? If you use the process of regression and go back in time, those concepts aren't part of the physical world. So how did they get into the brain? They could not have done it. There must be something other than the brain. A better explanation than the human being, all right, being simply a body controlled by a brain, is that the human being is a dualistic being. There's the physical body, and then there's the immaterial mind. And that immaterial mind is the real you. Now, when we do open the Bible, we find in Genesis chapter 1, 26 and 27, that after God created the universe and the planets and the physical environment and then created the animals, the very last thing he created was human beings. And he created humans in his image. And what that means is that humans are in some way like God. Well, how is it that humans are like God? Well, it's not in any physical sense. God doesn't have a physical body. He's not made of flesh and blood like we are. He's a spirit being or a mind being. He's a thinking being is what he is. And when the Bible says we are created in his image, that's what it's talking about, that human beings are fundamentally thinking beings. We are minds. The difference between God and humans is that we are embodied. That's one of the differences. One of the other differences is that he's the eternally existing mind, and we are newly created baby minds, but we are the same kind of being that he is. So think of what happens when a couple reproduces and they have a baby. Okay, the baby is just a tiny little baby, but it's the same kind of a being that the mother and father are. It's the same kind of being. It's a human being. And over the years, it's going to grow and develop and mature, and eventually will grow into a mature human being like his or her parents. Okay? So that's kind of the way humans are. We are the same kind of being that God is. We are thinking beings. We are mental beings. We're babies because we just came into existence a short time ago, but we will always exist. And see, this is the fundamental difference between materialism and dualism, is the kind of being a human being is. Dualism says that a human being is both physical, or let's use the word material, and immaterial. We have a body, but we are a mind. Okay? Now, here's the thing. If this is the case, and I believe there's sufficient evidence that can be arrived at logically to demonstrate that this is the case, then when the body dies, the real you continues to live. the real you, the identity that is you, that has your set of values and your experiences and your reactions, and the part of you that thinks and wills and determines and decides, and all of these different things that makes you a unique personality, an individual, different from every other person on the planet. Okay? That part of you does not die. It continues to live. So yes, there is an afterlife. There is life after death. The body dies, but your mind doesn't die. That's very important to understand that. If you take the materialist position, then the human being is just a body controlled by a brain, and in essence, you're not much more than like a weed that grows in your yard. Okay? The weed isn't there, and then one day you walk out and you see the weed has popped up in your yard, and if you don't go and eliminate it right then, it stays there for a while, and it spreads some seeds around, and then it dies, it withers and dies, and that's the end of it. It's gone. Or you come along with your lawnmower and you mow it down, or you go get some weed killer and you spray it, and then it shrivels up and dies. But the weed is just comes into being. The seed blows in somewhere and it gets in the ground and it grows up, and there's the weed, and then it produces more seeds, and then it dies and it's gone. Okay? Materialism takes that same kind of attitude about the human being. You're born, you live, you die. And when your brain ceases to produce brain waves, and you've probably seen that on TV or in books or whatever, they can hook up electrodes to your head and they can monitor the brain, and there's little brain waves going on in there, little activities going on, right? When the line goes flat and your brain isn't producing brain waves anymore, the line goes flat, you're gone, you're dead, you no longer exist. And that whether that happens 6 minutes after you're born or 100 years after you're born, when the brain ceases the brain waves, you're dead. Even when the heart stops beating, the brain still produces brain waves for a while, until the blood flow stops and goes, and then the brain ceases to function, and then you're gone. Okay, that's what materialists think. Is that you? Is that what you are? You're just a body controlled by a brain, and when you die, you cease to exist. That's a sad view of life, and of course, in that case, there's no real purpose in life other than your purpose. Well, I want to be a doctor. I want to be a lawyer. I want to be a teacher, or I want to be a really good master criminal and commit the perfect crime, or whatever your purpose is in life. That's all there is. It's just what you decide, and that's it. There's no more purpose. There's nothing greater than that, nothing beyond you. You make that decision, and you live, and then you die, and then you're gone. The other position, dualism, says you're created in the image of God, and once you begin to exist, you will always exist as an individuated self in some form of some phase of life, and that physical death is really just a transition from this physical phase into the next phase of life, and you go on and continue to live. So how would I answer the question, is there an afterlife? I would say, you bet there is, yes. All right, I'm a dualist. Specifically, for those who have a philosophy background, I'm a Cartesian dualist. And that has to do with Rene Descartes and his way of understanding humans and human beings. And there are not a lot of philosophers who are dualists, and especially Cartesian dualists. Most scientists and philosophers are materialists, and that's really sad. I don't think they're looking at all the data. I think they've taken a very, very naive and foolish approach to life and to data and to evidence, because there's a good deal of evidence concerning the kind of being a human is. Now, if this is something that you want to think more about, I've written a book called Proof of God, Inquiries into the Philosophy of Religion, A Concise Introduction. This is a book that I wrote when I was teaching philosophy and teaching the course Philosophy of Religion. And in here, I discuss the kind of being a human is, and we talk about these things in more detail than I've been able to in this short video. But this is something you need to think about, and there's really very good evidence that we are dualistic beings, and that, yes, there is an afterlife. So those are my thoughts for the day. I hope you found them interesting and helpful. As always, I would advise you to read your Bible, pray, go to church, and may God bless.